The LZX Industries Mapper is a polar to Cartesian colorizer. What that means in English is that you can think of colors in the more intuitive hue, saturation, and brightness paradigm instead of having to always think in RGB. This module serves two main purposes. It takes a hue, saturation, and brightness input, and then converts them to either YUV color space or RGB color space. It also has a few other mathematical tricks up its sleeve that we'll look at later in the video. But to start with, let's look at the most basic case of using this as a colorizer. First thing I'm going to do is generate a shape. I'm going to use topogram for this, but you can use pretty much anything you want. So I'm going to take one of these key outputs, and I'm going to put it into the hue on Mapper. Now first we're not going to see anything, and that's because our brightness and saturation are turned down. So as I turn the brightness up, turn the saturation up, and turn my hue attenuator up, start to get some rainbows. As I soften this range on topogram, start to get some wider rainbows. This is sort of the default thing you can expect from Mapper. As you see, if I turn saturation down, the image will desaturate, eventually just turning to white. If I turn it back up, we get different saturation. And if I turn the brightness down, same thing. Eventually this will go black. And then we want to go back up to bright. And if I unplug this hue, we're just going to get a color, solid color. And here, as I scroll through, I can get all the different colors of the rainbow. And then, of course, we can modulate any of these. So as you can see, getting all the beautiful shades of the rainbow. As I make this shape harder or softer, the area where that rainbow is going to compress. So as you can see, this module gives you a way to think about color in a more intuitive fashion. So let me turn down the range just a little bit here. There we go. So I could take saturation input. Let's say we just go on the vertical ramp for this. And so now we can adjust the saturation in the middle of the image. Make it more or less saturated. We can also invert that control. There we go. Get that nice saturation just in the middle. We can also add something to the brightness. Let's add a slightly different ramp. And again, we can invert. And just use a cleaner ramp there. There we go. And then we can play and adjust these different settings. Do we get something that feels good? We also have these YUV outputs, so let me show you what those do really quickly. The Y output is probably going to be the most useful in the majority of your patches. The Y output gives you a black and white version of whatever's coming from the RGB outputs. This is similar to terminology used elsewhere in LZX modules, like the Y outputs on the memory palace. YUV is the color standard that video actually used for a long time. In some cases, it still does. Instead of having separate channels for red, green, and blue, it has a separate black and white output, and then two color outputs. It uses different variations of a red and a blue channel that can, when multiplied correctly, create all three color channels. The way it looks when we're just looking at it though, so there's the U output, and there's the V output. Whether you understand these technically or not makes no difference. The cool thing is, it's just two extra outputs for us to play with. So we could run these to further processors or just put them in a colorizing scenario. So I'm just going to do this. Just nice and simple. But there's a ton of different ways you could use these things. And I'll sum these together. So essentially, they're just extra outputs. You could try combining them in arch or curtain, etc. So the nice thing is we have these 6 different outputs that are all being controlled by the same set of controls. And this is giving me a lot of freedom in how I'm going to colorize my patch. And of course, if you want to animate any of these inputs, the easiest way is going to be to take the input signal, and as we often do, sum it with something using a passage. So here I can just take a simple LFO, set this really fast just so I have the range. And I want, good. Slow it down. So now we can create some animation in there. And of course I could start animating my modulators. You also have a switch that doubles the range of the hue control. This can be very useful in certain circumstances. So there you have a basic rundown of the mapper inputs, outputs, and general controls. It's an extremely interesting colorizer and very different from the other offerings in the LZX line. Next, we'll look at another patch exploring a different workflow for using this as your main colorizer. In this next patch, we're going to look at how you can create a more controlled composite using the mapper as your main colorizer. One tricky thing about using mapper is that the hue input can be very extreme. If you have the attenuation turned all the way up, it tends towards these very rainbow shapes, and then if you bring it down, you create a more limited range of colors. But in the event that you're trying to mix multiple different shapes, you're only going to have one control here for the hue. Very quickly, everything can turn into a mess of rainbows, which might be what you want. But in the case that you don't, let's look at how you can create a more intentional composite. So to begin, I'm going to take this output from Diver, and I'm going to plug this into the in channel on a passage. I'm going to make sure this switch is set to post, and then let's take this output and take a look at what it looks like into the hue input. So I'm going to set my hue CV control all the way up, and my hue control itself all the way down. And then I'm going to start adjusting the 2 controls in my passage. Now, a good way to think about this in this sort of setup, I'm going to zero these both out. The input plus or minus control sort of selects the range of possible colors, and the bias control then tells it where in the color spectrum to exist. So let me turn this up a little bit so we start to get some color. And you'll see as I bring this control up, I'm getting more and more hues until we get to full rainbow. And if I slide this bias control, it's going to affect where the midpoint of that rainbow is, but it's still rainbows. So as I bring this attenuverter down, you'll see we're getting a smaller and smaller number of hues until we get it very, very close, and we should be all in basic yellows. But now as I move this, it's still moving through the cycle of hues, but we're getting a less dramatic number of hues. So now it's just picking one hue and its closest neighbor, and I can cycle through which hues those are. So this is a great way to get some control over your mapper. So now I'm going to create a second shape. I'm going to take the H plus V ramp. I'm going to put this into polar fringe just so I can get something fairly hard-edged. I'll take the key output, and I'm going to go into another channel of the passage. So now I'm going to want to mix these two together. I'm just going to use the basic mixer on bridge. Of course, any mixer would work for this. So I'm just going positive, positive. You can see the polar fringe shape. Let me actually pull out. So I just pulled out the shape coming from Diver there so we can see clearly what's going on with our second shape. So again, let's see here. There we go. So again, it's the same idea. If I adjust my attenuverter here on the input, I get more colors, and the bias control tells me where to center those colors. So if I only want very few colors, there we go. So let's do that. And now when I put this back in, it's going to sum. So we might get a little bit of an unpredictable result at first. There you go. You could also subtract the two shapes from each other before putting them into the passage so that they wouldn't overlap. But that's a little bit more advanced. So now you can see both of our shapes. We're able to limit and get very specific about the sort of colors we want in our composite. Let me switch this up to mirrored. Nice. There we go. Let's keep it like that for now. And so that should give you some idea of how to get more specific control over your colors. Obviously, you can use different types of mixers, logic processors, etc. to expand on this technique. Finding precise ways to mix before hitting your hue control can make a huge difference. And now one last thing for this patch. Since we have this inverted key output, we can put that into our lightness control. And again, use this sort of like a VCA. So here I'm subtracting the outside of that key. And then we can continue to play with our colors until we get something nice. So it takes a little while to get the hang of using Mapper as your main colorizer, but it is possible to get some pretty sophisticated and precise results from just this one module and a few utilities in a colorizing setup. And of course now we can play with our polar fringe. You can set the diver to animate. We could even drive some corresponding animation to the to the polar fringe. And so now you have a much more specific control over your color palette. In this last patch, we're going to look at something of a secret bonus feature of Mapper. Like with all LZX modules, although it may be labeled as a colorizer, it can also be employed as a specific and unique ramps processor. To set this up, we'll take the U and V outputs from Mapper, and we'll sum them with ramps from our visual cortex. So in this case, I'm using a passage. It's going to take the U and V outputs, and we're going to sum those with horizontal and vertical ramps. I'm going to take my outputs from passage. I'm going to plug those into a mixer, just using the mixer on the bridge, but you can use any type of mixer. You could also use logic functions on the arch for a slightly different look. And let's just take a look at what that's doing. So all I'm doing is, with no inputs to the mapper, taking the U and V outputs and summing those with the ramps. So now as I adjust the hue and saturation, you'll start to see them doing something pretty special and unique. I'm going to turn off mirroring for a second. So you can see this gives you a pretty flexible way to get a little bit of movement out of your ramps. I can't really tell you technically why this does what it does. I'm sure someone smarter than me can chime in the comments. But in terms of use, this gives you a flexible and fun way to animate your ramps for further processing. So just for fun, let's go into a topogram so we can get a little bit of color. I'm just going to randomly grab a couple of these outputs. So let's do that, and that. And so you can see the hue control is giving me quite a lot of flexibility. And the saturation. We We can also play with the passage, adjust the bias, adjust how much of this effect we're seeing. We also still have some inputs to play with. So notice right now we're not inputting anything at all into the mapper. And we're still getting a pretty interesting effect here from modifying that ramp. So what happens if we start to put some inputs in? Let's take the diver, since it's right here. Let's take the horizontal and vertical ramps and plug those into saturation and hue inputs. Turn my lightness up all the way. And we can start to apply how much of this we're seeing. There we go. So now as I start moving these other ramps around, we start to get some different things going on. Let's try doing this. There we go. So now we're getting this really cool, nice, organic, kind of interesting modulation happening. So I could set these both to scroll. And you'll notice the brightness control is almost acting like a sort of VCA. So we could go into that control and let's plug in, let's say, a prismatic ray. I'm going to sync that, turn it up. So now we can add these little ripples in there. There we go. And again, we can play with different shapes on our ramps. And we can play with our different inversion switches. And there you have it. So while it is certainly a very useful colorizer to have in your system, Mapper also gives you a very unique way to process ramps. This ramps workflow can also be used in combination with Navigator Shape Changer and the upcoming Cro-Magnon. It's a really great way to add a little extra organic modulation to pre-existing ramps. We hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, please leave any questions or ideas for future videos in the comments below. Thanks for watching.